in terms of profitability and working more hours to make more profit, the first thing I tell people is, at what point do you reach maximum? You max out pretty quickly because you can only work a certain number of days in a row at a certain number of hours before you just collapse from physical exhaustion. So you reach maximum pretty quickly. Now, if you're talking about making good decisions, you don't max out. And that essentially is where you make more money.
Is there such a thing as work-life balance? If so, how do you achieve it? I caught up with AgriFocused Carmen Quade recently, who shares some of her insights into some of the simple things you can do right now to get that balance more in your favour. Welcome to Shared Ag Solutions by BCG. I'm Janine Batters, and today we're going to be talking with Carmen Quade from AgriFocused. And the topic of today's discussion is organising your farm for profit and work-life balance, which I think is going to be really interesting, particularly at this time of year. Now, just before we jump in, Carmen, can you just give our listeners a little bit of an overview about who you are and why you do what you do?
Thanks, Janine. So I'm a farmer. So we've got a farm business in Tallimba, which is in the Northern Riverina of New South Wales. So we're predominantly cropping, but we've got a few sheep and we run a family partnership with some other family members. And I have AgriFocused, which is my work. And I work with farmers to improve their farm businesses. And I really love that. And we're raising a family and doing all the things that everybody else are trying to do along the way. So Janine, this is going to be a really interesting chat because I don't have that advantage of being one of those consultants who haven't got like an active working farming business. And I think when you're like that, you think everything is perfect and it's easy to implement all these solutions. And we're going to have this chat. And I want to start off by saying these things are really, really hard. We struggle with them in our farm and in our lives. And I think all of us do to some degree. So it's not about there is this perfection, this illusionary area that you can be 10 out of 10 in this all the time and everything works all the time. It doesn't. And it's a really slow process to improve these sorts of things. It's just about having a think about them. And I think every year or so, identifying a couple of little improvements that you can make within your farming business to improve that work-life balance without sacrificing the profitability.
I love that you said that, Carmen, about the perfection, and it is a little step by step. It does take time. So you also work as a university lecturer in accounting and agribusiness. You have a Master of Professional Accounting and a Bachelor of Business, as well as Certificate 4 in Training Small Groups. And I just wanted to mention that because I feel like you have a really well-rounded, you're sort of seeing it from all angles. You understand the finance behind a business as well. You're not just going to say, well, just go to the beach every weekend, because you know that farming doesn't really work like that. We'll get into it. What would be the first thing if someone was to come to you and say, look, we're working really hard, business is doing pretty well, but we're just feeling a little bit overwhelmed and we just feel like we're working all the time. We never get to have a break. What would you say?
Well, I think this is what people come up to me and say. They just say there is too much work to be done. And I think particularly it depends on which area you're in and where you're living and the pattern of the last 3 to 4 years. But certainly, so in our district, for example, not all that far north of us, they've had 2 really good years, a flood year, and then they're approaching a lower than rainfall year finishing up now in 2023. So it's just been a huge workload and a lot of unique situations which have required a lot of us in terms of time, like time in the paddock, time in the shed, whatever else, but a lot in terms of its cognitive load. So it's not business as usual. Every year seems to be like, new decision I haven't had to make before, new challenges and all of that sort of thing. So there's this big issue of too much work, and we can go through and explore some of the things about how we deal with that. And there's this other issue that sits behind it, and that's our attitude as farmers to work and rest and play. And there's a lot to unpack there about how we view ourselves and how we think farm businesses or farmers should work and how hard they should work, and where the profit actually comes from.
Yeah, it's a really good point. But even me saying that to you, I felt a little bit guilty. I felt, because being off a farm too, I felt a bit guilty saying there's too much work, because I know in a dry year, that's not always the case. Sometimes it is, and you're working really, really hard, and then for whatever reason, it doesn't come off. But sometimes if there is not as good a harvest or whatever, you are not working, and that's when you do go on holiday a little bit earlier or something like that.
That's the funny thing, isn't it, about cropping in bad years? It's actually, if you can take the financial side of things aside, and yes, having potentially a business on the brink of collapse, crops can die without too much help from you. Whereas if you've got a livestock heavy enterprise, a dry year means a lot more work in terms of feeding and water and animal health issues and all that sort of thing. Whereas higher rainfall years, more profitable years in cropping businesses come with a lot of extra work. So there's extra spreading, there's extra disease burden for our crops, extra weeds to deal with. Obviously, at the end, extra grain to harvest, to cart, to store, everything else. So yes, sometimes you do feel a bit guilty like that. How do I resent the fact that this is work when all of this work is coming? Because essentially this year, where we have got a lot of work, my business is hopefully going to be a lot more profitable. So you feel a little bit, I know, guilty talking about that as a burden.
The other thing you said was there's too much work like that. That's one of the issues that why people are perhaps feeling overwhelmed. The other thing is, though, I feel like there's this idea that on farms, that's just the nature. There is too much work. So how do you work with your farmers to determine what is too much work? What does too much work look like? And how do you figure out what you're going to do?
Okay, I think one of the reasons why there's too much work, why there ends up being too much work, is because farmers are by their nature optimistic. If you were perpetually pessimistic, there is no way you could put a crop in every year. It would just do your head in, and you just would not find working in this industry at all rewarding. So you have to think that prices will go up. You'll have to think that this crop is going to come off at the end. Even though, you might be doing all your fancy risk management stuff behind the scenes, you have to have a general attitude of optimism. So when you have a general attitude of optimism, you don't account as much for things to go wrong. And I think that's what tends to happen, that people say, okay, look, we've got enough staff to do this, or I have enough time to do this job. But then they don't take into account breakdowns and wet days and all of that whole, I guess, to sort of take a little bit of a tangent. As people that live in rural areas, we hold a much greater domestic, social and community load than a person would who lives in an urban area. We've got more travel to deal with. We've got more funerals to attend, more community events to coordinate, to volunteer at, to participate in. We've generally got a higher fertility rate than most urban couples will have. So there's not so many farming families with one or two children. They tend to be a little bit skewed towards that larger side. We've got to take care of our own water, our own garbage, our own trades, our own odd jobs. So there is a lot we're putting on top of this already busy farming business. And then we're being super optimistic. We're going to get through this spreading season without a breakdown. The spray is going to run on time. It's going to be right. The people are going to have the spray that we need in our local branch, and we're not going to have to drive somewhere else to get it. So I think sometimes it's about, when we're looking at these too much work situations and our planning situations, we have to be a little bit pessimistic about how long things are going to take, how often people are going to turn up, whether we're going to get sick, whether someone else in our family is going to get sick, and how we factor that sort of stuff in. So it's about building a little bit more slack into the system and into the program to allow for things to take a little bit longer. So I think the one question to ask yourself is, if I over-resource this, so if I add in too much labour or call in a contractor to help or allow myself a little bit more time to do this job, what is the worst thing that can happen?
Farmer's going to say my profit's going to get cut. That's what I can't have my profit cut, Carmen. I have to do it all myself.
But I think, look, in the scheme of things, yes, perhaps outsourcing or, getting your entire spray program done by someone else, yes, is perhaps going to, when you've already got a sprayer and you've already got workers lined up there to do the job, it's going to have a huge impact on your profit. But there's a lot of other things that aren't. And if we look at it in percentage terms over our whole turnover, these costs are minimal. So I had a lovely LinkedIn chat with a few people that were just chatting about how keeping the casuals on after harvest to participate in that cleaning up, packing up, bit of grain work, all of that sort of post-harvest maintenance stuff that needs to be done the catch up on the livestock work is actually a really productive use of that labour whilst you've got them there on farm. In terms of profitability and working more hours to make more profit, the first thing I tell people when they've got that sort of attitude, and we're exploring that, is at what point do you reach maximum? So you level out. So if you're saying, okay, well, if I do all of this work myself, or all of these jobs myself, or all of this machinery maintenance myself, you max out pretty quickly because you can only work a certain number of days in a row at a certain number of hours before you just collapse from physical exhaustion. So you reach maximum pretty quickly. Now, if you're talking about making good decisions, you don't max out. And that essentially is where you make more money. And it might not seem like that. You might say, okay, well, look, if I do this 10-hour shift on the tractor and I'm saving myself $40 an hour for a casual, then I essentially save $400. If you make a really good decision about machinery acquisition or farm expansion or preventative maintenance or whatever program you're going to do, you can make more than $400 in a day.
That's such a good point to make about making sure that you're not taking too much on.
Yeah, so at the lighter end, when you're a little bit tired, you don't make good decisions. When it gets into that point of exhaustion, you also have an increased rate of preventable breakdowns and machinery accidents. Now, this is aside from all of the indicators that they have for those terrible health and safety accidents, injuries and deaths. Many of us have managed to not have too many of that, but everybody can talk about a preventable machinery breakdown or a major accident that is fatigue related. So they're the things we're not talking about. So yes, we do 10 hours on whatever piece of equipment it is. We save our $400 from paying someone else to do it. But then, because we're tired, because when we got home, we had to do all of those other things that I was just rattling on about, that domestic, community, social load, we're exhausted. And then the next day we break something, which is like $1,500 worth of parts to fix, plus 2 days of not doing anything, plus the travel time, etc. And making that link between fatigue and breakdowns and accidents sometimes is a little bit harder to connect, and it involves a little bit of introspection and perhaps stepping up to take that responsibility and making that connection.
It really does make sense. Even if something was going to break down already, just being alert enough to think, oh, that I can hear that rattling. So easy for that thing to then become a bigger problem, isn't it?
I can hear it, that I'm running late, and that'll mean jumping out to check it. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. Optimistic again, aren't we? It'll be okay. It'll be okay. And then it's not. So they're the money things that you can put around the downsides of that attitude. That other thing is what happens in the long term if we don't live this life that includes rest and play. And some clear things happen. And they happen in families that tend to work really, really, really hard, potentially to build a legacy for their next generation. And all the next generation see of agriculture is this attitude that money is always scarce, that we always have to work really, really long hours, and it's hard. And you might not have every one of your children then stepping up to say, this is what I want to do.
So how do you figure out how much is too much? Like, obviously when people get overwhelmed, that's too much. You don't want them to get to that stage.
Starting off by tracking it, it's really valuable. Even if it's just a note in a diary, or you can get a simple little app to track what you're doing. And that's always the first step. So you can say, okay, this is how much this is work time, this is rest time, this is play time, this is travel time, and just get a bit of a picture on, and it's hard to say in ag, depending on the industry you're in, what a typical day, week, month is, but just try and do that just as a starting period, perhaps not so much in those peak sowing or harvest periods, but in those months that we try and say there's not as much going on, and have a really good look at those. You can perhaps work back to that ideal of a 38-hour week, but some people will choose to work more than that. Some people will choose to, and they'll do it with ease because of their level of physical fitness. They'll do it with ease because of their level of organisation. It's really interesting to actually reflect on how long we can work and how well we can work when things are going right, as opposed to how long and how well we can work when things are going wrong. So that goes back to that organisation, planning, delegation, etc. If everything's ticking along nicely, you can get to the end of a 10-hour day and go, gee, I'm feeling good. I'm feeling rested. I'm feeling pumped. I'm feeling, just keen to maybe finish off these few little things and then go home, or go home and still be able to do this, this and this and this. You have one of those days where everything goes wrong, and potentially it's going wrong because you haven't been all that organised, or you haven't done the things that you needed to do to get things structured. So I think there's so much benefit in getting these little planning things in place, resourcing things properly to, yes, make the day run more smoothly, get more done in less time, but also get to the end of the day feeling like you're satisfied rather than feeling like you are exhausted and you're feeling defeated and nothing happened.
And everyone wants to feel like they had a satisfying day, right?
Yeah, I think, don't we all? Just those little things about sitting down on a Sunday night or on a Friday afternoon and saying, okay, what's my next week look like? What have I got in that I can't move in terms of my family obligations or my work obligations or my commitments to other people? And how am I best going to spend the time in the days and pockets of time that I've got left? And what do I need to organise now, or who else do I need to organise now to help me do that properly?
I do that. I don't put in travel, which is interesting. And what about phone calls? Could you put in phone calls? Because it would be really interesting to see, depending on how different farms operate, how much time are you spending on the phone when perhaps one meeting for the week might cut out, I don't know. Do you find that a lot?
So you're talking about this incidental phone calls between team members. Yeah. That is really interesting. And they're a really good thing to reflect on and see where you're at with those. So are they things like, where have you left that air compressor? And is the big tractor in this paddock or in the other paddock? And what are you doing now? Are they those sorts of phone calls, which we should potentially eliminate by some structured communication in a meeting, or perhaps the use of an organisational app or a WhatsApp group or something like that? Or are they actually social conversations to meet our social need, which are really important, which we don't want to eliminate? Are they strategy type communication? So the two sorts of communication we really want to focus on is the social communication and the strategy communication. All of that little admin stuff, we want to try and get rid of that as much as possible. And that's by having things where things are put back where they should have been put back, where we know what other people within our team are doing, when they're going to be in town, when they're taking a day off, all of that sort of thing. Just keep in mind, letting someone know you're going to be somewhere, do something, is not actually asking them permission. So if you're in a team of equals, or you're the boss, and you decide you want to take Friday afternoon off, or you've got a dentist's appointment on Tuesday morning, letting everyone in the team know that you're not going to be there is not asking their permission, it's communicating. That's okay. Still let everybody know on the team. So we can eliminate that sort of stuff and we know where people are and what they're doing.
Yeah, I think also though with the strategy type things, what are we doing this week, or what are we doing? Are they best in a meeting? Because sometimes they're the conversations that, when you're trying to make a decision, trying to figure it out, they can eat into family time, football time.
Yeah. So that when we're having those family meetings, when someone's getting together for a kid's birthday party and the blokes are standing in the corner talking about how this needs to be redone and that needs to be rebuilt and this is broken down and everything else. So yes, I agree. Having that structured time to say, this is the time we sit down and talk about these operational issues, and whether that's the Friday afternoon or a Thursday morning or whatever set time it is that you decide works for you because of whatever else is going on in your farm and in your life, having that to set that plan out for that next week or that next fortnight. So, a fairly firm plan for the coming week, and then perhaps a looser plan about what the week after is going to look like as well.
Carmen, you were talking about that work-life balance, and a lot of people have this idea of farming, farmers work really hard. Is it harder for them to work a normal week because they feel like they have to?
Look, culturally, there is this attitude within rural communities that idealises hard workers. And we often hear that. You're talking, that's, that person from that town, 2 towns away from us. Oh, they're real goers. They're really hard workers, that lot. Put his daughter on because she'll be a goer, because they are just workers and goers. And that sort of attitude is really, really respected and admired for obvious reasons. It's like any good thing, when it's taken to the extreme, that's when it gets really difficult. And that's where it becomes a problem rather than an asset. So we've got that cultural idea around it where we think people that work hard are good. So the reverse of that is people that don't work such long hours might not be so good. And then we've got those people within themselves that feel that their value is tied up in how they work. Now, that might be a combination perhaps of their personality or perhaps an attitude that they tie their value as a person around how hard they work and how much they bring. And potentially this is often more men than women. Their role as a provider in the family is part of the way they care for their children. And the way they care for their wife is I work and I work. The way I love you and the way I show I love you is I work. And the harder I work, the harder I love you. And that often sends a really mixed message to the rest of the family who really want to have their time and their company and their support, and they don't want them to be so cranky and worn out all the time. For those people that are personality-wise or culturally-wise really focus on working, I think it's about having a good chat to the people around you and saying, well, what do you want our life to look like? Expressing really clearly what you think about work and how that is your expression of love for your family, but also giving them that opportunity to say back, is this getting too far one way and not far enough the other?
An easy thing to, well, it's probably not an easy thing to do, but it could be a really simple thing to do. And also perhaps give people more control than they thought they had. Some people want to work all the time. If they're happy doing that and it works for their family, then great. But if they don't want to work or they're feeling resentful or they're feeling worn out and their family are telling them that they want to spend more time with them, then you're saying there are actually things that you can do that are going to still mean that you can run a really profitable farm, but you can also have that family time.
I think if you look back at all of the major religions, all of them have within them rest days. And I'm not talking about just the Christian religions and the various offshoots we have around Christianity. If you look at all of the other major religions, rest and dictated rest by a higher authority is a fundamental core of most religious practice. Time for festivals, time for celebrations, time for all of those things, again, is in all of these religions. So this isn't just something that's an issue for farmers in the Mallee in 2023. This has been a common issue for humanity for as long as we have existed. And recognising also that because our culture and our communities used to be far more agrarian than they are now, these are potentially socially constructed ideas that have come up to address these very issues in, ancient Mesopotamia and rural China and all of these other areas, because they recognise that if people did work all the time, if they took no time off to celebrate, if they didn't sit back and reflect on the year or the season or whatever else, they wouldn't be living a good life. So this is not a unique issue, and sometimes putting that structure around things that perhaps was once enforced on us by those religious practices is a good thing. A generation or two ago, there were probably lots of families that just did nothing on a Sunday. And within our local districts, we might have families and communities that are perhaps more connected to those older traditions and may still not work on a Sunday. And I would hazard a guess, if you look at those families within your district, you would say that they are just as, if not more productive than those families that continue to work through the whole year.
And it's not just farming, it's all these industries that are busy, like you say, and it's not just this time. So what about sheep? Because sheep just throw that crazy element in there that if you're doing just sheep, then you're doing just sheep. But if you're doing sheep perhaps as a risk management strategy, so you've got cropping, you've got your sheep, perhaps you've got hay as well, just to make it interesting. How do you keep the sheep but not have them be always taking up your rest time, rest days? Oh, and the sheep got out.
So this is that issue of the more variables in anything, the more variables in your family or the more variables in your business, whether it's a farming business or your tradies, the more likelihood, the high likelihood of an unpredictable outcome. And we're going to have to deal with that. Now, sheep by their nature or any livestock enterprise is going to have a greater deal of volatility because it's not as predictable as, say, a tractor or an agronomic response to a particular spray or whatever else. They tend to be a little bit more unpredictable. So I think I don't talk much about our own farming business, but this is something that we've struggled with. And we actually got a consultant in to say, how can we do this better and more easily? And she just went bing, 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 shifted the calendar, changed the mobs around and went bang, and talked to us about when everything else was going. And we just had a shift. And I think it wasn't anything that any one of us couldn't have worked out on our own, but it was just about having somebody out that's just looking, taken a step back from the whole enterprise and said, look, you can just make these changes to it to actually streamline that, to make it so much easier. You can actually have a lower labour import and still have the same level of productivity from that particular enterprise. The first thing you need to do is potentially reduce your variables. So, if you've got multiple enterprises within your livestock enterprise, reducing those. If you're trying to do start and first cross and second cross and you dip your toe in the whole Dorper game for a bit, it's about consolidating that and saying, okay, how can we streamline that and make it more simple, less variables? How can we then change our timing to either smooth out that feed burden so we're not actually having to feed, so we can make sure that the sheep are easily fed within our existing system so we can eliminate that step? Or how can we make those peak times of livestock labour need not interfere with the peak times of our cropping system need?
Yeah, it makes sense to get advice on that. Would you say to maybe have that pessimistic view of it and over-resource?
Oh, for sure. So that means like more rouseabouts in the shed, more people helping you get sheep away after shearing, more days allocated to crutching, instead of just relying on people to turn up because they've always turned up every year at that particular time, being that very polite, very respectful greasy wheel that picks up the phone and rings and confirms and checks in a couple of weeks later and confirms again. Those things are really, really, really important. That's not just about livestock enterprises. That's for any aspect of our farming operations, and making sure that we've got the feed on the ground, the physical resources that we need, the machinery that we need, being a little bit, pessimistic about whether things are going to break down. So we're just really on top of our pre-service and pre-maintenance programs.
That would make sense. And then if you're having that forward planning, that's all adding up to more work-life balance.
Yeah, but you can't do that if your brain's tired. So it's all this interconnected loop, isn't it? So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, you can't plan because it's just too hard because things always go wrong, that potentially is your existing exhausted brain. If you're there going, oh, I actually could perhaps start a little odd jobs list so that when my staff or when I have got half a day or a couple of hours to do something, I've got a list of things that we can just work through and gradually tick off over 2 or 3 months. Even if it's just something as simple as those drums need triple rinsing before they're put in that stack, or that needs dropping off there, or this needs picking up. Give people the benefit of you being organised and you giving them that work that they need to do.
That's actually a really good point, isn't it? It might be that time where you do take a step back and talk to your family, check in on how much time you're spending with them, check in with your employees, see how they're going, and maybe getting the consultant for the sheep, or just even yourself, just having a look.
Yeah, and putting those dollars around timeliness is really, really important. So it's not just potentially you're talking about those livestock enterprises which you think are pulling sort of time and resources and adding to the chaos. Sometimes in some cropping enterprises, it's contracting sidelines. So they've got their core business, which is essentially a farming business, but they've also got essentially a contracting sideline. And it's this contracting sideline that tends to add to the chaos, add to the variables, suck resources out of the core business. Yes, it's adding a lot to the bottom line. So we see this lovely contracting line on our budget. It's dropping in there every year quite reliably. What we're not seeing is the line above, which is the cost in terms of what's not happening in the paddock on time. So it's actually reducing our grain income line. And what we're not accounting for down below is all of that extra burden in terms of gear getting worn out more quickly, people getting worn out more quickly. So being actually really realistic about farms go through the business life cycle. Where are we at now? Is this contracting still part of our core business? Is it still adding more than it's taking? Or has it got to the point in our business where we no longer can do it? Do we need to add in staff? If it doesn't make money for us when we're adding in staff, is it time to actually put that to the side?
For the planning for profit and work-life balance, it just keeps coming back to planning. And on your website, on your homepage, you have keeping your eye on the goal ahead. If you step back, know what your goal is. If your goal is more land or whatever your goal is for your farm, but also having that goal, checking in with your family, checking in with yourself and saying, how am I going?
Yeah, look, checking in with your values. Perhaps it's just an exercise with you, or as a family, it might be a broader group, but checking in on what you actually want to get out of life is a really important thing to do. And you might do that, once a year around New Year's time. You might do it in the middle of the year, on your birthday, on your wedding anniversary. Set a date and just try and check in on those big picture things. Do we still both want this? Is this still really important to us? And what do we need to tweak around the edges to make sure that we're heading in the right direction? I think that's really, really important. The rest piece is really important. So the holiday piece is really important. And it's pretty easy to put the structure around booking 2-3 weeks a year off farm in one long stretch every year. The other thing that we don't talk so much about is having an off season. And in our off season, we're working about a 30-hour week. And we're doing that for a stretch of time. So that's when it might be January when we're just pottering around, or February when it's too hot, or it might be in some people in those cooler districts, they might take things easier for a month over winter. And that is really, really important. And it's not talked about as much. We talk about having a holiday and how important that is, but having that off season where we're just not pushing it is so important as well.
Because I know we were talking about the last sort of 4 or 5 years. I feel like there used to be an off season. I've spoken to a lot of farmers. I have a lot of friends on the farm, and you're running from harvest to sheep, to sowing, to spreading, crutching, and you're just running.
We could talk for 15 minutes about why there's not an off season, and we'd talk about things like business growth and all sorts of different things and change of enterprises and seasons and whatever else. The solution is actually additional resources. So that's just additional boots on the ground, hours in the week allocated to doing these jobs. And it's also about effective management and delegation. So that's the other area that farmers tend to fall down a little bit on, because it's a learnt skill. And because if you've been in ag in a smaller sized enterprise for your entire life, you have probably not seen those skills modelled. And you haven't had any explicit instruction in terms of a training environment on those skills. When you're saying things to yourself like, it's just easier to do it myself, or it's just easier not to have anybody here at all, if you're saying things like that, you probably haven't invested enough time in your own professional development in the area of management and delegation.
But also knowing that there are things available that can then help you give you those skills. They are, as you said, learnt skills. So you can get them and then they can help you. I think that's quite exciting to think that there's so many little things that you can do. It's just about being able to zoom out. I'm hearing zoom out and then keeping your eye on the goal ahead.
Yeah. And if you've got staff, perhaps the first stage is to just sit down with them and ask them, perhaps in the ute, because it's really hard to eyeball people with these difficult conversations, perhaps in the ute, just say, look, I've been your boss now for 3 years. Is there anything that I can do to make your work life easier? And they might talk about, we need a second battery for this, or we need to do this, and we need this. No. Let's redirect. What am I doing in the way that I am running this business, or coordinating your work, or coordinating my own work, that I could be doing better to make your day-to-day easier? And seeing what sort of answers and what sort of conversations that tends to spark. They're really hard if you haven't had those conversations before, and they can be incredibly confronting, but very, very valuable.
Well, they are your resources. So if they're happier at work, then it's only going to be a benefit for your business as well. So I think it's just really exciting. There's lots of cool little things. So if there was 3 things that you tell people to do, if they felt like feeling a little bit overwhelmed, Carmen, what am I going to do? There's too much to do.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is come back and have this conversation, or do this work, or have these thoughts when you're well rested. That might mean just a weekend off, or it might mean a couple of weeks off. It just depends on where you're at and how long it's been since you've had a bit of a break. So make sure you're approaching this challenge well rested to start with. Then it's about looking at mapping out, if you need to do it on a calendar, whatever else, what job you've got to do across the year. breaking it down into months and weeks, asking yourself, if I over-resource this, so if I actually build in an extra bit of extra slack in the system, what's the worst thing that can happen? And also, what's the best thing that can happen? And checking in again with your values about where you want to be with your family. When you look back on those 10 years, I think those are probably the most important things to think about.
Achievable things to think about too when you're well rested.
Yeah. And look, have a think about that really big structure around things. We talked about don't work on Sundays, or we have this off season, or we have these rules. Some people who are those really noble, hardworking, bullet-a-gate farmer will only really thrive if they have very firm boundaries about work. That is the only system that works for them. If you talk to them about values, if you talk to them about organisation, if you talk to them about all of that, they will do all of those things as well, but they will still do those massive days, week after week after week. So for them, perhaps the best thing to do is to actually put some structure around it and say, we don't work on this particular day per week. We take this period of time off. We also take these other periods of time off per year, and put some rules around when things are talked about and when they're not. So we don't talk about farm stuff after tea. We don't talk about it at birthday parties. And those strict rules tend to work with those people. Not straight away. Takes a bit of time to implement them, but they tend to be the best strategy, I think, for those people.
And it can also help if they've then got those strategies, then if the hay truck's coming, can I load you on a Sunday? Oh no, we have a work policy where we don't load trucks on Sundays. Or it makes it easier for them, because it gets hard because there's trucks coming and there's deliveries coming, and I can just take that, and it won't take long. But then you've taken that, so you haven't been able to go out for breakfast with the family, and it just happened.
Yeah, or but stating your point and giving people the choice is saying, I'd prefer not to do it on a Sunday. We really don't work here on Sundays. Can we fit it in on another day? And they might say, oh yeah, no worries. I'll do old mate's on Sunday. He doesn't care, and I'll do yours on Tuesday. Perfect. When we're put with this offer of someone else to do something on a day which is outside our work boundaries, we sort of look at it as an all or nothing. He either does it on Sunday or he doesn't do it at all. We can say, this is what I would prefer, and give people the option. And most of the time, when it works, they'll work around us. And sometimes behind the scenes, the hay carter's going, oh, thank goodness, I really didn't want to do that on Sunday. Or they get onto the end of the Sunday night and they say, oh, gee, that was a nice time taking the kids to town to go to the pool. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. And it's not all or nothing with any of these things either. Like you say about the work-life balance, if you decide to have a Saturday afternoon off, or you decide to drop some of your sheep, or it's all just making things work for that amount of time. Nothing's black or white. It doesn't have to be all or nothing.
No, and these businesses change, don't they? Year on year, as our families grow older, as we age, as other people around us age, there's no constant. So we just need to be going back to those basic principles of time management, of what our values are, of really trying to live the life that we want to live, going back to those, and those tools will work for us whatever stage we're at.
Well, I really appreciate your time, and I really look forward to hearing more from you and how you can help farmers. Is there anything else that you'd like to say just before we finish?
Look, I think if you're the person here that's under pressure and you're trying to institute some change within your farm business and within your family, there's not going to be any quick wins. If you're what you're trying to do here in an organisational sense is cultural change, and those things take a really, really long time. So don't get defeated and don't give up. Just keep gently standing your ground, forcefully standing your ground when you need to actually implement this change, because executed well, it has intergenerational benefits, because we want our kids, if they end up in farming, to be running productive, profitable farming businesses and not working all the time. And if we want that, we've got to model that ourselves.
That was Carmen Quade from AgriFocused. To find out more about Carmen and her work, take a look at our show notes. Hope you find your work-life balance sweet spot. Until next time.